Chapter 1 talks about all the ways that tests influence the major events in our life, in our careers, and our education paths. So, my topic is all about Chapter 2, the historical, cultural, and legal ethical considerations. In this, I'm going to discuss how tests evolved of where they are today. That history of psychological testing is a fascinating story and it has abundant relevance to present-day practices or tests today. As early as 2200 BCE, China had systematic tests that were used to select and promote for government jobs. Individuals passing the test were entitled to a number of privileges which varied depending on the current dynasty. The ancient Egyptians in Greco-Roman cultures also had ideas relating to mental health and personality, but they really didn't have any formal means of psychological assessment. Charles Darwin's interest in individual differences led his half-cousin Francis Galton to devise a number of measures for psychological variables. In Germany, Wilhelm Max Wundt started the first experimental psychology laboratory and measured variables such as reaction time, perception, and attention span. In contrast to Galton, Wundt focused on how people were similar, not different. In fact, Wundt viewed individual differences as a frustrating source of error in experimentation, and he attempted to control all extraneous variables in an effort to reduce error to a minimum. James Cattell was an American who lived from 1860 to 1944. In 1890, he proclaimed the modern testing agenda in his classic paper entitled Mental Tests and Measurements, and he was responsible for mental testing in its own modern form. His work with mental tests and reaction times were a good start. He administered his mental tests to freshman college students at a couple of different universities where he worked over a significant period of time. The 20th century brought the first test of abilities such as intelligence. The measurement of intelligence. Alfred Binet and his colleague Victor Henry published several articles in which they argued for the measurement of abilities such as memory and social comprehension. In 1905, Binet and Simon developed the first intelligence test to identify intellectually disabled Paris school children. Before long, psychological tests were being used on a regular basis in schools, hospitals, clinics, courts, and prisons. World War I and II brought the need for large-scale testing of the intellectual ability of new recruits. After World War II, psychologists increasingly used the test in large corporations and private organizations. In 1939, David Wechsler, a clinical psychologist at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, introduced a test designed to measure adult intelligence. For Wechsler, intelligence was the aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with his environment. Wechsler Bellevue Intelligence Scale. The test was subsequently revised and renamed the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS. By the late 1930s, approximately 4,000 different psychological tests were in print, and clinical psychology was synonymous with mental testing. A government committee on emotional fitness chaired by psychologist Robert S. Woodward was assigned the task of developing a measure of adjustment and emotional stability that could be administered quickly and efficiently to groups of recruits. The committee developed several experimental versions of what were In essence, paper and pencil psychiatric interviews. To disguise the true purpose of one such test, the questionnaire was labeled as a personal data sheet. Draftees and volunteers were asked to indicate yes or no to a series of questions that probed for the existence of various kinds of psychopathology. The Woodward Psychoneurotic Inventory was the first widely used self-report personality test. An advantage of self-report is that respondents are arguably the best qualified people to provide answers about themselves. A potential disadvantage is that respondents may have poor insight into themselves, and people might honestly believe some things about themselves that in reality are not true. Some respondents are unwilling to reveal anything about themselves that is very personal or that paints them in a negative light. Projective test is one in which an individual is assumed to project onto some ambiguous stimulus his or her own unique needs, fears, hopes, and motivation. The ambiguous stimulus might be an ink blot, a drawing, a photograph, or something else. Perhaps the best known of all projective tests is the Rorschach, a series of ink blots developed by the Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach. Psychological assessment has proceeded along two lines, the academic and the applied. Academic tradition, researchers at universities throughout the world use the tools of assessment to help advance knowledge and understanding of human and animal behavior. In the applied tradition, the goal is to select applicants for various positions on the basis of merit. Culture and assessment. The socially transmitted behavior patterns, beliefs, and products of work of a particular population, community, or group of people. As taught to us by parents, peers, and societal institutions such as schools, cultures prescribes many behaviors and ways of thinking. Spoken language, attitudes toward elders, and techniques of child rearing are but a few critical manifestations of cultures. Culture teaches specific rituals to be performed at birth, marriage, death, and other momentous occasions. Professionals involved in the assessment enterprise have shown increasing sensitivity to the role of culture in many different aspects of measurement. Evolving interest in culture-related issues. Early psychological testing of immigrant populations by Henry Goddard was controversial. He found that the majority of immigrant populations were feeble-minded. Goddard's findings were largely the result of using a translated Stanford Binet intelligence test that overestimated mental deficiency in native English-speaking populations. Goddard's research sparked a nature-nurture debate where IQ results indicative of some underlying native ability or the extent to which knowledge and skills had been acquired. In the 1930s and 1940s, developers of IQ tests devised culture-specific tests and clarified that the tests were not intended for minority cultures. Yet, the tests were used on individuals belonging to other cultures. For example, the 1937 revision of the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, which enjoyed widespread use until it was revised in 1960, included no minority children in the research that went into its formulation. Similarly, the Wechsler-Bellevue Intelligence Scale, forerunner of a widely used measure of adult intelligence, contained no minority members in the samples of test takers used in its development. Some issues regarding culture and assessment. Communication between assessor and assessee is the most basic part of assessment. Assessors must be sensitive to any differences between the language or dialect familiar to assessors and the language in which the assessment is conducted. Assessors must also be sensitive to the degree to which assessors have been exposed to the dominant culture and the extent to which they have made a conscious choice to become assimilated. Verbal communication. Language, the means by which information is communicated, is a key yet sometimes overlooked variable in the assessment process. Most obviously, the examiner and the examinee must speak the same language. In interviews, language deficits may be detected by trained examiners but may go undetected in written tests. Assessments need to be evaluated in terms of the language proficiency required and the language level of the test taker. Nonverbal communication and behavior. Humans communicate not only through verbal means but also through nonverbal means. Facial expressions, finger and hand signs, and shifts in one position in space may all convey messages. For example, one who fails to look another person in the eye when speaking may be viewed as deceitful or having something to hide. However, in other cultures, failure to make eye contact when speaking may be a sign of respect. Standard of evaluation. Judgments related to certain psychological traits can be culturally relative. Cultures differ with regard to gender rules and views of psychopathology. Cultures differ from one another in the extent to which they are individualist or collectivist. Individualist culture places value on traits such as self-reliance, autonomy, independence, uniqueness, and competitiveness. While collectivist culture value traits such as conformity, cooperation, interdependence, and striving toward group goals.